pleased and honored to gather Mr. Ladwig's thoughts and remembrances about his time in the United States Army during World War II. Now, I'd like to begin, Frank, by asking you a little background information as to where you were born, a little bit about growing up there, a little bit about family life, school, and what it was like where you grew up.
Okay. Before I answer your question, Jim,
Yeah.
I'd just like to say I'm very honored to be part of this Veterans History Project, and I thank you very much for all the work you've had to do to get ready for this.
Well, this is a very special moment for me to be here today interviewing you. So,
You know, to relive things that happened 64 years ago is heartwarming to me, because it makes me think about my old comrades in arms
wonderful.
in France.
Yeah.
So what I thought would be helpful to my listeners is, first of all, I'd just like to run down the 7 major European campaigns, and then give you what I think are the 12 success factors of how we won.
Okay.
And please interrupt anytime you would like,
Okay.
and I'll slow down. You might have to throw a lasso over me, but
No, go ahead, Frank.
all right.
If you have that
I
fine.
was born in Vergas, Minnesota, June 11, 1917, and I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota. I went to college at North Dakota State University, and I got a scholarship to Harvard Business School. And when I came home from Harvard, I got a telegram saying, please report to the Boston Army base tomorrow for a physical exam before you are inducted into the Army, because I had taken ROTC in college, and I was a lieutenant, a second lieutenant at this time.
Okay.
Well,
What was the date, Frank? Do you remember what the date was? Was it
it was about December of 1940
so
that I got this call,
Okay.
this telegram,
early in the war?
and I reported for duty in the Office of Quartermaster General about the 20th of March, 1941.
Okay.
And this was almost a year before Pearl Harbor. And we went to work in civilian clothes at that time. And we didn't put on our uniforms until the day after Pearl Harbor, yeah.
Oh.
And I got married on December 28th, 1941.
This-
Our invitations went out the day after Pearl Harbor.
Oh boy. Okay.
And I didn't know whether I was going to get any leave or not.
Yeah.
So on Monday morning, I went in to see General Mike Eisen, who was my boss. And I said, do you think it would be possible if I could get the weekend off of December 28th to get married? And he looks at me and he says, you know, Ladwig, he says, I don't think the war's going to miss you that much. You go ahead.
Okay.
So we had a whole weekend for our honeymoon
This is in Boston?
in Boston.
Yeah,
We were
okay.
married in Boston.
Wonderful.
Um,
How old were you then, Frank?
23.
Okay.
I was 23 then, and that lasted 62 years. And it was a wonderful wedding, and we had 2 children. Ted was born in 1943 while I was in England. And I hadn't seen him till I came home, and he was 2 years old. But it took some getting acquainted.
Yeah. Who is this man?
Yeah.
Right.
And he says, "Don't hold my mommy's hand." And I said, "Good for you, Ted. I'm glad you feel that way." So, but the homecoming was wonderful. Jim, I think I'm one of the luckiest guys that ever went to war. Yeah. My younger brother was killed by a sniper on Peleliu Island. He was with the 1st Marine Division, and he served in Guadalcanal, New Guinea, New Britain, and he was in a hospital down in Australia. But he came back to his unit to go to this campaign in Peleliu. But my brother-in-law was in the Navy. I went in first. And then my brother went in, then my brother-in-law went in, and he was killed. So in our family, we had 33% casualties.
Oh my goodness.
And I always feel that soldiers get more credit probably than they deserve, because the people that stayed home did a terrific job. My mother and father and my 2 sisters lived in Fargo, in North Dakota, and when the war got going, they picked up everything, drove out to Tacoma, Washington. My mother was a typist at the Air Force depot there in Tacoma. My sister went down to Modesto, California to be an occupational therapist. My father was joined the receiving department of the Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation, and my older sister worked with the Human Services Group in Tacoma. Mm-hmm. And my wife was a volunteer at the Newton Wellesley Hospital in Wellesley. Mm-hmm. So our family had 100% attendance.
They were doing their job.
They were doing the job as they were asked.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what the soldiers did.
Yeah.
They did their job as they were asked.
Okay.
But I think that the civilians worked so hard to provide the weapons, the ammunition, the trucks, the ships, the airplanes, and all those things that we needed over there.
Absolutely.
And I don't think they ever got as much credit as they deserved.
Well,
for instance, there were 10 million young men that went into the services, and 10 million women took their place.
Right, right.
It is a thrilling story.
And those folks are being interviewed for this Veterans Project. So
I thought they were, yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm glad they are. I'm glad they are, yep.
Yeah. So take me. You want to do that, or you want to go to the? Go ahead. You got. I was going to say you could pick up with your draft notice and take us on through, or you can give us an outline of that if that's the game.
I have some notes here. They're rough notes, Jim, on the 7 major European campaigns.
Okay.
That I think people would like to hear about.
All right.
And
okay. First campaign.
The first campaign was D-Day, June 6, 1944, and its code name was Overlord. And I had a big part in that. Modestly, I say that, but I had 1,500 trucks to haul the soldiers from where they were bivouacked to the boats. And we had 4,000 landing craft to haul to the various boats. They were scattered all over southern England, and we would haul these to 4,000 landing craft. And we never missed a pickup, and we never missed a boat. But we practiced 11 times, 11 mounting exercises, so that we could learn how to put 130,000 troops on 4,000 landing craft in 30 hours. And we had them all on the landing craft on June 5th, because that was the date that was planned.
Right.
And but the weather was so bad, the General Eisenhower deferred that for one day.
Right.
But these poor guys on these boats, they bobbed up and down all day and all night, and they were all seasick.
Oh, I can't imagine.
I had hauled 14 truckloads of vomit bags to take care of them,
Oh my goodness. No.
because they knew they were going to be
Yeah.
sick, because they were just small landing craft.
So tell me a little bit about what you did personally, right, in the coordination of this this movement. I mean, were you present at near the landing craft? Were you back at headquarters? Tell me kind of what your
Well,
involvement was.
I started off back in our headquarters
Okay.
in southern England, but then I took the movement orders out to the various company commanders so that they would know what they're supposed to do, because it told them exactly where to pick up, which unit, and what route to follow to go to the ships.
Yeah.
Because President Roosevelt said he wanted the troops to be delivered to these ships in the best possible physical condition. And we translated that no soldier was to march more than a mile to get to his boat. And we learned how to put these 130,000 troops and 20,000 vehicles on landing craft in 30 hours. And as you know, in April, see, what we would do is we'd put these troops on the landing craft and send them out toward France, and then we'd have them hook around and attack Slapton Sands in southern England.
Right.
And the British had given us 5 miles of beach and 5 miles inland. So the Navy would shell, and one time they dropped a shell short and killed some people. But on Exercise Tiger in April, 9 German E-boats got in the tail of a convoy going back to the United States, and when they got opposite Slapton Sands, they left the convoy and got into our exercise and sunk 4 LSTs, and we lost 754 men. There's a monument to them on Slapton Sands today. My wife and I saw that.
Yeah. And that was kept secret.
Oh, yes.
You know.
We didn't want to discourage anybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's the same way on Christmas Eve, 1944, the King Leopoldville was sailing from Southampton to Cherbourg with 2,250 people to go into the bulge. And it just happened that a submarine was sitting outside of Cherbourg, and it sunk the King Leopoldville. And that was an unholy night. At 4:45, and you know, on Christmas Eve, most everyone is going to chow at 4:45.
Sure.
And but we had PT boats, barges, tugboats, anything that would float, because there's only 4 miles offshore. So they went out and they rescued about 850
Wow.
men, and the rest of them went to the bottom.
Oh my.
And our trucks met them at the in the harbor of Cherbourg to take them to a hospital. We cleaned out one hospital and put only these King Leopoldville survivors in there.
So the date of that would have been
December 44.
44.
Right.
Okay. So it's after the landing, and so you
Yes.
had secured the port of Cherbourg, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It was it would be before. No, it would have to be after the landings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which were due.
And these reinforcements were due to go to
the Bulge in
the Bulge.
44. Yeah.
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 Because
Okay.
we used to get 10 trainloads of casualties a day from the Bulge in Cherbourg.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
10 trainloads.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when you think about this D-Day amphibious attack, it's the most difficult kind of an attack you could have, because you were hitting head-on, and there was no way you could go around or fall back or anything else. You had to land and go forward.
Right.
And we lost 11% of our 130,000 troops in that D-Day. And when you think the first light on June 6th was at 5:16, and low tide was 5:25, and the HR was 6:30. And the engineers went in at 6:33, and they had a half hour to do their job of cleaning channels.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure you remember that there were all kinds of obstacles underwater,
right.
and all of them were mined.
Yeah.
It was a very difficult task, but the engineers did a terrific job. But seconds and minutes were critical, because the tide was coming in, and between 7 a.m. and 10 a.m., the water rose 18 feet. So they had to get the people in there and out of there quick.
Yeah.
And starting from Cherbourg, the Utah beach came first.
Right.
They had 2,000 feet of sand. And then Omaha Beach had 7,900 feet. And then 8 miles further down, there was the British beaches of Gold, Juno, and Sword. And the 4th Infantry Division landed on Utah, and the 29th and the 1st Division landed on Omaha. But the night before, the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne landed inland behind the defenders, and the 6th Airborne British landed behind the British. But the British landed 3 divisions, and we landed 3 divisions. And it's hard to describe the problems they had, because General Rommel of the German army had been given the job of defending this whole Atlantic wall. And it was his thought that the only way they could stop us was to stop us in the water. He said, we must stop them in the water. And unfortunately, he got approval to go home that weekend to visit his wife on her birthday.
Yes.
And his boss, I forget his name, but his boss was away on some conference, so their 2 big generals were away, and Rommel didn't get back until 10 o'clock at night on June 6th, and that was too late.
Yeah.
And Rommel was heard to say, if he was running the American landing, he would have had it all wiped up in 2 weeks. I don't know if he would or not, but anyway, I had a good friend in that Utah Beach landing. His name was Eugene Caffey, Colonel Eugene Caffey.
Okay.
And he and General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., were the first two men to step on Utah Beach. And General Roosevelt had gone to France 2 or 3 times a week in a 2-man submarine to reconnoiter to see how the Germans were placed back there. But Rommel had built blockhouses that were 8-foot thick reinforced concrete. And we bombed the daylights out of them, but they're still standing today.
Yes,
and I've been in them, and they have it all laid out as to the distance to every target. So they had divisions all along the Atlantic wall, and they knew where they were supposed to be firing so that they could stop us in the water. And it was they call it Bloody Omaha. Now, it wasn't as tough in Utah as it was in Omaha, but Omaha had about 20% casualties, and Utah had about 11. But in June 6, 7, and 8, we landed 140,982 people on that 50-mile landing zone. But it was really tough for everyone. Just imagine, it was cloudy, so the pilots couldn't see what they were looking down at, and the General Maxwell Taylor was landed, and he was wandering around all by himself. And they had a neat way of identifying whether they were friend or foe. They had these little clickers out of a Cracker Jack box, and if you heard something, you'd click once. And if they were friend, they'd click twice. So that they minimized the difficulty somewhat. But that's the first campaign, and it was a bloody campaign. The second campaign is the breakout and pursuit to the Filey's Gap. We more or less surrounded thousands of Germans in this so-called Filey's Pocket. And the Filey's Gap started in July 2nd, and Paris fell on August 25th, 44. And by August 1st, 100,000 U.S. and 100,000 Germans had died, and we had captured 50,000 German prisoners. So we did well at the Filey's Gap. The third campaign was the Lorraine Campaign. The 7th Army and the 3rd Army were the spearheads of that Lorraine campaign, and it was just headed off toward Berlin. And that campaign was completed on the 22nd of December, and the casualties were very heavy. Now, I participated in that through General Patton and his 3rd Army. They knew that they had these Germans pretty well surrounded, but they needed a left hook, as General Bradley would call it, a left hook by Patton to sew it up. And Patton hadn't been committed to the ETO yet, but he said, I need 100,000 tons of supplies brought from the beaches to Chartres before I jump off. So General Eisenhower's assistant, he's a general, I don't remember his name, but he called us in Cherbourg and said, "We have a big job for you. Come down to our headquarters, in temporary headquarters in Valone in the woods." And we went down, and he says, "We want you to haul 100,000 tons of stuff from the beaches to Chartres in 10 days. And then Patton will jump off on the 11th day to make a left hook and button up the Filey's Gap." And so he says, "What do you need?" He asked this of the base section commander that I was with. And Colonel Wyman says, and he surprised me, he says, "Well, I'll let Ladwig speak for us. He's our motor transport officer." And he surprised the daylights out of me. So I stood up. This general was on about a 2-foot platform, and we were in the cheap seats on the floor. And I said, "We think we need 8,500 trucks." The general says, "We agree." And I said, "And we need one-way roads going and coming." Your map shows that very well. See? One way was going and one way was coming.
Right.
And he says, "We agree." And I said, "We need full command over all troops in our area." He says, "We agree." Then I said, "In general, we need full headlights." You never saw such contempt in your life, Jim. He looked down at me and he says, "Young man," I was 27, "young man, do you realize we've been fighting for 2 years in Africa with blackout lights?" I said, "Yes, sir, and I've read all about it in the Infantry Journal and all the problems that you had." I said, "Now, I've been here 7 weeks. I've yet to see a German airplane." And I said, "And you know what our bombers have done to the highways. They had deep holes in the highways so the Germans couldn't reinforce their own troops." Right. See, we had them in between. And I said, he says, "Well, don't be a smart aleck." I said, "I'm no smart aleck," but I said, "I had 1,500 trucks in England to mount the invasion, and we never missed a pickup, and we never missed a boat. So we think we know a lot about operating trucks." Yeah. But I said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We will do the best we can, regardless of your decision, on one condition." He says, "What's that?" I said, "That you go from this meeting to General Eisenhower and ask him if we can have headlights, and tell him we feel very strongly on this. And but we'll do the best we can regardless. We'll go home to Cherbourg. You call us and tell us what General Eisenhower's decision is." And it says, "You might add that we don't think that you'll get 100,000 tons down there to Chartres unless we have headlights." You know, there were thieves all along the road. Yeah. If a convoy was going up a hill, those thieves would be on the trucks and have them unloaded before they got to the top of the hill. Well, anyway, we went back to Cherbourg, and about 10, 15 minutes later he called. He says, "I don't understand it, but Ike says to turn on the lights." And that night the French thought the war was over. And on the 3rd day, General Bradley came down to see how we were doing, because he was Patton's commander, and he thought we were doing pretty good, and I did too. I had all night long after our meeting in Valone, I called truck company commanders and relieved them of what they were doing, and told them to meet me at my office in Cherbourg at 8 o'clock the following morning, and I'd tell them about a very exciting mission that they would have, and that tell their men to take everything they've got, because it'll be a permanent change. And my idea was that we would haul from the beaches, all the beaches down to St. Lo, and then halfway between St. Lo and Shark, we would set up a bivouac area. So the driver number, there were 2 drivers for every truck. So that driver number 1 would go and pick up a load and come back to the bivouac. Driver number 2 would take it on to Shark, empty the load, maybe get a load of prisoners, and come back to the bivouac. Then these guys could sleep in between time. Because there was a discussion in the beginning of whether we should have 2 men drive all the way per truck. But one of my old friends, Colonel Parrott, said, Ladwig, they won't get any rest bouncing along in those trucks. Let one guy take it halfway and the other guy take it the other half.
Yeah.
So that's what we did.
Yeah.
But after the initial run, we turned this whole Red Ball Highway over to the Motor Transport Brigade to run, because they were set up to do this. I had a couple of men to help me, but I couldn't continue that. We were going 20 hours a day.
Now, wasn't that the 419th, the Negro truck drivers? Was that part of that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And but we turned this over to the Motor Transport Brigade.
Right.
And after a week or so, I was sick as a dog, and they put me in the hospital in Cherbourg for 10 days.
Yeah.
They thought I had a heart attack, but it was just this stress.
Stress. Yeah.
So, but everybody did everything they could.
Yeah.
But that's the Red Ball Highway that unleashed Patton in the Filey's pocket there. Then the 4th, the Lorraine campaign was the 3rd, and the 4th was the Siegfried Line campaign, which lasted 3.5 months. There was, in the Siegfried Line, there were 3 miles of tank traps
Yeah.
made out of concrete,
Yeah.
and 3-mile deep belt of anti-tank devices. And about the end of the Siegfried Line campaign, which lasted until from 26th of August to the 15th of December. And Montgomery failed to live up to his promises. He promised General Eisenhower that he would make Antwerp his first priority, but he didn't. And the Canadians came in and captured the port before they could blow it up. But on the west side of the Scheldt River, there's 16 miles of Scheldt River from the Atlantic into the port of Antwerp. And on the west side, or excuse me, the east side of the Scheldt River, the Germans were there, so it wasn't a full capture. And but Montgomery had a favorite project called Market Garden, and it was a total disaster. And I hate to say this, but I think he got what was coming to him. Then the 5th campaign was the Ardennes Forest, or the Battle of the Bulge. It was the major German counterattack. And they had 28 divisions. They had a tremendous force they had been saving up for this counterattack. And it was the largest ground battle of World War II. 81,000 U.S. casualties resulted there, and 100,000 German casualties. Germans lost 800 tanks, 800. And Patton all along suspected that this German counterattack was going to occur, so he had made contingency plans. So at this General Army Commanders meeting, Beadle Smith says, can anybody, any one of you, get up there and help them out at Bastogne? And he asked the British guy, and he says, well, I don't think that Montgomery could do anything because he's in the process of reorganizing and getting ready for going to further east. When he came to Patton, he says, how about you, George? What was that?
That's fine. That's it. Now the tape shut off. Go ahead. Keep
Okay.
talking. So
And,
he said to Patton, yeah.
And he came to Patton, and Patton says, I can be there in 48 hours. And Beadle Smith says, be realistic, George. And he says, no, I suspected them of that, because he was a student. See, and most of these generals, like Eisenhower patterned a lot of his stuff after General Grant. And these Germans had favorite successful army commanders of the past.
Yeah.
So Eisenhower had 85,000 men in his army going straight east. He stopped them in their tracks, turned them 90 degrees, and went 100 miles north to Bastogne. And on December 28th, he blasted a hole only 300 yards wide between the German defenders, because the Germans had surrounded Bastogne. But I gave him a lot of credit. They said, Patton, how do you think you can ask your guys to leave a battle, the Battle of the Siegfried Line, and dash 100 miles to Bastogne? He says, they're soldiers. They will do what I ask them to do. And he was, to me, the hero of Bastogne. And then the sixth campaign was the Riviera to the Rhine. It was the most successful amphibious operation in the ETO. It started at Saint-Tropez down on the Riviera, and they were the southern front. And they had the 1st French Army, the 7th U.S. Army with General Patch, and the 6th Army Group with Lieutenant General Devers were fighting against the German 19th Army. And during that time, the Germans received 1,000 airplanes, 1,000 airplane bombardment for 45 minutes, where 2,500 tons of bombs were dropped. That's when they practically leveled Berlin. It was really something. Then number 7 was the last offensive. It began in January 45, and it went to May 8th, VE Day. But Simpson's 9th Army and Montgomery's 21st Army Group, 1st Canadian Army, and were in this final offensive. And Patton captured 100,000 Germans west of the Rhine on the 23rd of March. And Hodges' army captured 317,000 German prisoners.
Amazing.
And when they were captured, see, we didn't have supplies. That's 400,000 men in one.
Right.
So what they would do is they would say, all right, lay down your weapons right where you are. Now go back to your bivouac and get your canteen and get your knives and forks and blankets and so forth and come back. And they were afraid of the Russians, so they did just that.
Yeah.
And most of those guys ended up in Cherbourg. See, what we had almost 2 million German prisoners during World War II in Cherbourg, and we divide them up. The ardent Nazis would go to the United States. Troublemakers would go to the United States. We had room for about 400,000 in Normandy. In Fouquerville, we had a 66 or 60,000 camp, and in one pen we had 50 German generals.
Wow.
But they were hard to deal with because they were always belly aching.
Yeah.
But one of the things that interested me very much was at the end of the war, before VE Day, on the 12th of July, President Roosevelt died.
And where were you when that happened, and what was your feeling? Him being
A friend of mine had given me a radio.
yeah.
He went back to the United States and he asked me if I had any use for his radio. I said, I'd like it. I was in my room at the Hotel Normandy in Deauville, and I heard this. It was really a kind of a shocking experience. It's like when Kennedy died.
Yeah.
You can't believe it.
No.
And but on the 30th of April, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the bunker 50 feet under the Capitol there in Berlin.
Berlin, yeah.
And Mussolini was hanged in Italy,
Yeah.
and Churchill was voted out of office in June.
Yeah.
So all of these people that were the real leaders of World War II were gone.
Yeah.
And I shipped out of Antwerp with Colonel Caffey on the Atlantic Trader on the 20th of October. I met Caffey in the hall one day. At that time, he was our deputy commander. And he says, Ladwig, I understand you're going home. I said, yes, sir. He says, how are you going? I said, I'm going on the Green Project. The Green Project was an airplane project from out of Marseille, France, to the United States. And I thought that would be neat. I had some contacts in Paris that would get me on that. And he says, you don't want to do that. Caffey was a big, gruff man. He says, you don't want to do that. He says, you look like hell. You go home and they'll think you have been in a war. So he says, you come with me. I have a tanker up at Antwerp. We were in Brussels at the time. I have a tanker up at Antwerp, and you come with me. And we'll talk about D-Day and other things on the way home, which we did. A very wonderful man. But those are the 7 major campaigns. D-Day, Breakout and Pursuit of Filese, the Lorraine Campaign, the Siegfried Line Campaign, the Battle of the Bulge, the Riviera to the Rhine, the Southern Front, and the Last Offensive. Now, as you know, I have a lot of opinions. And
I think you should.
I think that there were 12 reasons why we won. I call them my 12 success factors as I saw them. The first one was that we had 50 new scientific weapons of war, from radar to the atomic bomb. The Loran devices, MEW, M-E-W, all these devices helped us knock out the submarines. We could spot a submarine with these new scientific devices 3 miles away. And Alfred Lee Loomis was a big New York financial genius, and he wisely had sold all his holdings before the Wall Street crash in '29, so he was loaded with money, and he was a very creative man. And one man in Washington says that no one person was responsible for our victory in Europe. However, no one was more responsible than Alfred Lee Loomis. He worked with Carl Compton of the MIT Radiation Laboratory and with the head of the laboratory in California, and he worked with military research groups and university labs and with British research groups. And they came up with 50 devices that, for instance, when the Germans would come to bomb London or Plymouth, they could spot these planes, they could determine their altitude, their speed, and their direction. So they would call the British fighters, meet them at such and such a place, at such and such a time, and knock them out of the air. And they did the same way with the submarines. Now the second success factors were our air forces and our submarines. Our U.S. Air Force and our 9th Air Force and the British Air Forces, they could put 1,000 planes in the air, and the best defense against a German sub was an American sub. One day I can remember when we were in Deauville, 11 o'clock in the morning, 1,000 airplanes, they were all U.S. daylight bombers, B-17s.
B-17s, right.
They flew over Deauville, headed for Germany. And they just kept coming and coming and coming. And they went and bombed Essen and some of these other places where they even created firestorms.
Yeah.
It burned up the whole thing. And the third factor, in my opinion, was that we won the Battle of the Atlantic. When you think that we had a 3,500-mile supply line, and that should prevent any army from beating them. But we had wonderful merchant marines, and they, for instance, 320 merchant ships were sunk in 6 months alone in 1940. And but they learned how to have better convoys, and with the new weapons to spot submarines 3 or 4 miles away, it saved our lifeline. And then we had the arsenal of democracy. Now, this is what we talked about earlier, where 10 million women took the place of 10 million young men, and they met the needs for weapons, ammo, planes, ships, tanks, trucks, and so forth. And the fifth success factor was the fact that we won Overlord, or D-Day, in spite of the terrific storm in the Channel on the 19th of June. The biggest storm that Channel had seen in 100 years, according to the book. But because we didn't just willy-nilly send a tremendous flotilla of boats and ships, we had 8,000 airplanes. We had about 7,000 Navy ships, besides our 4,300 landing craft. And we were practiced. We knew how to control this gigantic armada. But 8,000 aircraft, 700 warships. We had all sizes of warships.
And you're right. How do you practice for an event of that magnitude. You're right. So
You set
that
up.
in itself is a success.
That was Overlord. That was us.
Right. Yeah.
And there was a man named Admiral Moon that was the commanding officer of the 10th Amphibious Force of the Navy.
Yeah.
He had very high standards. One day he and I were working together at the Slapton Sands beach, and he said to me, "Ladwig, I wish things were going as well out there as they are in here." I said, "Thank you, Admiral." But anyway, at the end of the war, he committed suicide.
Oh my.
He thought he had failed.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people died,
Yeah.
and he thought if they'd have done better, they'd have had fewer casualties. And he might be right, but on the other hand, he did a terrific job.
Yeah.
And the sixth reason is that we had superior leadership and great allies. When we had President Roosevelt, we had Secretary of War Stimson, General George C. Marshall, Admiral King, General Eisenhower, General Bradley, Admiral Moon, General Spaatz of the Air Force, General Patton, General Hodges, and General Montgomery of the British. And we had the great Prime Minister of Britain. He was
Churchill. Yeah.
he was a help.
Yeah.
And when you think of Hitler, they were scared to death of even waking him up to tell him that we had landed.
Yeah.
They didn't wake him up until 10 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
And we had been going since midnight with the thing. And we had great allies. The British, the French, the Poles, and a number of other smaller ones. And they all would listen to General Eisenhower. Even the bomber barons. We called these big Air Force generals bomber barons. They didn't want anybody telling them how to run their business. But Eisenhower finally had to go to President Roosevelt to say, their plan is good. What they wanted to do is they wanted to bomb Germany into submission. What Eisenhower, and kill a lot of Germans. But what Eisenhower wanted to do was to have these airplanes support our ground troops. And finally, Roosevelt had to step in and say, Eisenhower is the supreme commander, and you will do what he says. Right. And so we got great support from the Air Force. And then we had soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force were terrific. We had 20 to 30 million draftees and reserved, and they fought like veterans, and they were really heroes. Overlord just had to succeed.
Yeah.
And then we had the best logistics. The head of our logistics was Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee. John C.H. Lee. They used to call it Jesus Christ himself Lee, because he was a big ego guy, and he had his own private railroad train called the Alive. He'd come roaring in to do an inspection in Cherbourg, for instance, and he would say, I want you to set up Mass at 6 a.m. at the, not the Catholic Church, but the, what's the other church that has Masses?
I don't know. I'm a Catholic, Frank.
Yeah, well, so am I. But,
okay, go
but
ahead.
anyway, it was the other church that has Masses.
Yeah.
He was one of them.
Yeah.
And everything had to be exactly the way John C.H. Lee had it. But he in the ETO, we had 3,065,565 men. And of that total, 979,637 were in logistics under John C.H. Lee. In Normandy Base Section, where I was, we had 360,000 men. Now, do you know what logistics is all about?
No, please tell me.
Okay. Logistics means that having the right people and the right equipment at the right place at the right time. And that's what we did better than anyone else.
Yeah.
And I say that modestly, but I was a logistics man. The 7 chiefs of services, the chief engineer, the chief quartermaster, chief signal officer, and so forth, chief of ordnance, they reported to a G4, assistant chief of staff, G4. Well, they got Colonel Kemp, who was my boss. I was the deputy G4.
Yeah.
They got him fired. And General Oran made me G4. So here was a logistics command dedicated to just logistics, and he made me the head of logistics, 27 years old. The first thing I did was to call these chiefs of services together. And I said, gentlemen, we've been friends for a year and a half.
How many men were you talking about?
7.
7 men. Okay. Yep.
But we had 360,000 all
Yeah,
told.
right.
I said, now, we've been friends for a year and a half. You got Colonel Kemp fired, and you can get me fired too. But if you do, you're liable to get a saluting demon in here. He might be a high-ranking full colonel that'll make your lives miserable. So I ask you to do one thing. Don't take your problems to General Oran. Take them to me. He pays me to solve these problems. And I said, if I can't solve them, we'll go together to General Oran. And they were real gentlemen, and they never went to General Oran, and we did very well. And when General Oran went to China to be head of the services supply in China, General Koenig came to be our commanding general. And we had a lunch for him. And I went up to say hello. I said, welcome to Normandy Base Section, General.
Who's this now, General who?
General Koenig, K-O-E-N-I-G. Egmont Koenig.
Yeah.
I said, welcome to Normandy Base Section. Ladwig is my name. He says, what's your job, Colonel? I said, I'm your G4. He looked me up and down. He says, well, you're a pretty important guy. I said, well, I don't know about that. But I said, I work very hard, and we've been doing pretty good. Well, after lunch, he got the chief of staff aside, and he says, will you get me a new G4? He says, the way I operate, I want the G4 to be a high-ranking full colonel, so I don't have to arbitrate all the arguments between the chief engineer and the chief quartermaster, chief of ordnance. So get me a high-ranking full colonel. So they said, okay, we will. But they were all my friends. And at the end of a week, he asked the chief, how you coming on getting a new G4? He says, well, we have one name, but I don't think you'd like him. He says, okay, keep trying. Well, at the end of the second week, they were at a base section commanders meeting in Paris, and he asked him again, how you doing in the G4? He says, we aren't getting very far. He says, well, I think you can stop looking. I can't really fire that young fella if I can't find anything wrong with them. But they were model citizens.
Yeah.
They made his life a dream by not bringing him the problems. And when I left, even though he wanted to fire me, when he came, he says, I went in to say goodbye to him when I was going home. He says, for whatever it's worth to you, Ladwig, he says, I have given you the highest efficiency rating of any officer that I rate. One of the reasons was that after VE Day on May 8th and 9th, General Eisenhower visited the German prison camps where our soldiers were being held prisoners. And they called them ramps, recovered Allied military personnel. And he was so pained at the squalor that they were living in. They were skin and bones. A friend of mine had lost 70 pounds in a German prison camp up on the North Sea. He said, I want all of these prisoners out of every German prison camp by the end of the week. I said, General, Normandy base is not ready. They were told to be ready for such a thing in the middle of June. And this is the 1st of May. Yeah. He says, I don't care. I'm convinced that our men will be better off in American hands than they are in these German hellholes. Yeah. So his assistant has called me on the phone from Paris, and he says, can you take 66,000 ramps by the end of the week? I thought for a minute. I said, what would General Koenig say? So I said, yeah, send them. So I stood up, walked down to the general's office, and I said, I just committed you to a tremendous job. I said, I committed us to accepting 66,000 ramps by the end of this week. He said, good for you. So imagine running a hotel and getting 10,000 guests a day.
My God.
But I told him, I said, here's my plan. We'll get all the engineering troops we can get up there to Camp Lucky Strike, yeah, and finish up that camp in 4 or 5 days. And I said, there's an armored division sitting down at Rouen doing nothing, waiting to go over to China. I said, why don't we call Paris and ask to use that division to run Lucky Strike? They had a major general, and they're good at organization.
Sure.
So we asked Paris for the use of that division until we could get our own guys together, and he gave it to us. And the Red Cross girls met these ramps, gave them coffee and donuts, and one ramp died of eating donuts. See, he had had such bad,
shouldn't have been, right.
His stomach was not in shape, so we had to say, no more donuts, no more coffee.
That's
so we really did that well. Now the 10th,
yeah,
the 10th, the 9th was the Battle of the Bulge, thanks to the 101st Airborne, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Army. We won the Battle of the Bulge. And we had the best, the 10th factor was we had the best medical services. In Normandy Base Section, Colonel Phillips, my roommate, managed 40,000 hospital beds worth of hospitals. And they had an average daily population of 30,000 patients. Now that's a lot of people to get well and send back into the fight. And the 11th factor was we had the best intelligence. We could read the German mail because we had decoded their Enigma machines.
Yeah.
And the 12th was that the Germans are getting their heads beat off by the Russians. For instance, at the Battle of Moscow, there were 7 million men fighting each other, about half Russians, half Germans. In the Battle of Stalingrad, it was even bigger. There were probably 10 million all told.
Yeah.
And they beat up on each other. And that continued. And if the Russians hadn't been on our side and were beating up on the Germans, they'd have been beating up on us. So that there were more Germans committed to the Russian front than to the Allied front.
Right.
So those are my 12 reasons. Do they sound reasonable to you?
Absolutely. That's you should be writing a book with that information, Frank. Huh? That's awesome.
There's one other thing that I think would be interesting, is that in the fall in Normandy, it rained every day, all day long and all night long. And our men had no recreation, and they were sleeping in pup tents. It was terrible. And since they had no recreation, they'd go out and get in trouble. We had a crime wave in Normandy where there was a major crime a day, punishable by death, every day. We hung 9 American soldiers at Fort de Rule.
Hold that. All right, go ahead. I just want to put this in. This is important stuff here. This is
stuff that nobody knows about.
well. Let me see if we go this way. Right? Okay.
But
Go ahead.
we hung 9 soldiers up at Fort de Rule. The British hangman would come over on Friday afternoon and get a list of the people to be hung the next morning. And we asked that a man from the soldiers' unit would be there, a man from the family of the victim, and a man from the French gendarmes. And we wanted all of these people to realize that we were doing the best we can to stop this.
Yeah.
But it was all because of Calvados. Calvados was the liquor that was made from apples. These Germans, or these bootleggers, would take their little distilleries into the apple orchards and make Calvados right there on the spot and sell it right off the trailer. And it would make, some reason or other, it would make ordinarily solid citizens go mad, and they would commit murder and rape and things like that. And at one time we had 200 in our prison at Le Mans. It was very serious. So one Saturday night, Colonel Wyman got us all together, and he said, this crime wave could very well jeopardize our ability to perform our mission. I don't know the answers to it, but I would ask that each one of you think about nothing else in the next 24 hours but how to stop this crime wave. And we will meet back here Sunday night at 8 o'clock, and we will solve this problem. So Sunday night at 12 o'clock, we were all there. And I was a major at the time, and the rest of these guys were all full colonels. So he said, now, what's the answer? So he called on Donald McGowan, Colonel Donald McGowan. He was the provost marshal, and that's his responsibility. And he says, what's the answer? McGowan had 3 good answers. First of all, close all restaurants and bars and make them off limits to U.S. personnel. Second is drive the bootleggers out of the apple orchards. And third, in our MP Jeeps, let's add a Navy shore patrol and a French gendarme. So if they come upon a crime scene, that one of the 3 would be able to help. Because remember, these were all French. Most of these were French civilians that we were killing. And so Wyman says, thank you very much, those were good. So then he turned to Colonel Herb, the chief engineer. He says, what ideas do you have? Well, Herb was clever. He says, I think McGowan has covered it very well. So he had no ideas. And he goes to Judd, the chief quartermaster. What's your ideas? He says, I agree with Herb that McGowan has covered that pretty well. And he really had thought it through pretty well. And so he went around the room to the full colonels, and he was discouraged. He says, well, we didn't get, Colonel Wyman said, we didn't get much out of that. So then I said, Colonel, if you still have some more time, I have some ideas. He said, okay, let's have them. I said, well, I live in a building. I lived in the same house with Colonel Wyman. I said, I sleep under 3 blankets, and I'm not too hot. But I said, these poor guys are sleeping under 2 blankets. That's all they're authorized. I said, I think we ought to, we've got soldiers marching around mountains of blankets. I said, I think we ought to issue them a 3rd blanket, so they'd be at least sleep a little warmer. And so he turned to Judd, the chief quartermaster. He says, Judd, do we have mountains of blankets? Judd says, yes, we do, but you have no authority to issue them. See, everybody was bound by the book.
Yeah.
And he says, Wyman says to him, oh, yes, I do. Under the prerogative of command, I say, issue the 3rd blanket to Ladwig. So I had blankets. Then I said, these guys are sleeping in pup tents in the water. Right. You can't insulate a pup tent. And I said, these guys aren't dumb. They know what we have. I said, we have 10,000 hospital tents in our German depot, not a German, in our engineering depot, and we're issuing to German prisoners. I said, I think we should put our guys in these hospital tents rather than pup tents.
Yeah.
So he turned to Herb and he says, do we have 10,000 big tents? He says, yes, sir. But I don't think you have authority to issue them. He says, give them to Ladwig. Then I said, we have a letter from General Eisenhower giving us those beautiful prefabricated buildings down in Valognes, because they had moved from Valognes to Paris and gave us these buildings. And we had a platoon of soldiers marching around them so they weren't cannibalized. So I said, Colonel Kemp and I have been arguing about this all day long. You know, it's not smart to go over your boss's head. But I said, we've been arguing about this all day. And I think we ought to dismantle those prefabricated buildings and give one to any unit that wants it. They don't have a place that's dry to eat. They don't have a place to write a letter. They don't have a place to play ping pong or play cards or just talk. I think we ought to give one of those buildings to each unit that needs it. So he turned to Kemp and he says, Kemp, do I have a letter that says I own those buildings? He said, yes, you do, but you never know when Eisenhower will ask for them back. He said, I didn't ask you that. Do I own them now? Well, yes, you do. He says, give them to Ladwig. Then I said, now over in England, we have a warehouse full of stoves. What I recommend is that we take a ship and go over there and get a shipload of stoves to put in these tents that we're setting up so that they can dry their clothes out. And so they can get dry at least once a day.
Yeah.
So he turned to Judd and he says, do we have a warehouse full of stoves? He says, yes, but again, you don't have the authority to issue them. He said, oh yes, give them to Ladwig. So I had blankets, tents, stoves, and prefabricated buildings. So for a few days, I was a hero. But it worked out very well.
Yeah.
You know, these soldiers, they're not dumb. They know when we have facilities that they aren't able to use. But
this was taking place when, Frank?
this was taking place.
What date was this sort of thing?
This was the last of September and the 1st of October.
Of 44.
44.
Okay.
44.
So things were still, the battle was going on.
Oh, the battle was going on, and we were just that far from not being able to perform our mission because they had this crime wave.
Crime waves, okay.
But it worked out pretty good.
Excellent.
But
How we doing?
I'd like to close with a neat
Okay.
quote from General Eisenhower. We had millions of people coming to the beaches to see the cemeteries, pay respects to their kin and so forth. And on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, General Eisenhower came and to Omaha Beach, and sitting on a rock wall in the cemetery, he could look out over the beach. And he spoke eloquently for the dead when he said, these men came here, British, Allies, and Americans, to storm these beaches for one purpose only, not to gain anything for ourselves, not to fulfill any ambition the Americans had for conquest, but just to preserve freedom. Just to preserve freedom. Many thousands of men have died for such ideals as these. But these young boys, they were cut off in their prime. He really felt it. He says, I devoutly hope that we will never again see such sights as these. And I think and hope and pray that humanity will have learned. We must find some way to gain eternal peace for this world. Now, that was our Supreme Commander.
Excellent.
Thanks, Jim, for giving me this opportunity to tell you all about my thoughts.
Frank, thank you very much. Thank you. My God, I feel like we could go on here for more. Let's take a break.
Okay.
All right. Uh, Frank, I don't know what to say. I came here to ask you questions for the Veterans History Project, and you've given a magnificent presentation. So tell me about your presentation and what you've done with it.
Well, I gave this to 13 veterans at the Watch Hill Nursing Home, and it was a 2.5-hour presentation, and they liked it. I gave it to the president of the 5th Infantry Division reunion last Labor Day. All of the veterans of the 5th Division that were still alive met here in Mystic, and the president of the association was a veteran of the Vietnam War, so he really didn't know much about the war in Europe. And our family doctor was a friend of his, and he asked me, would I come and bring him up to speed on...
he knows now, doesn't he?
He does now.
Yeah.
And I sat at the head table of the...
Oh, wonderful.
Of the 5th Infantry Division reunion. I warmed up on a friend yesterday. We had lunch together, and I gave him some of these ideas.
Yeah.
But you know, I was very much impressed with our leadership. I should have gone more in detail. I started off in the Office of the Quartermaster General in Washington with General Henry Moneykeisen. And then I had Colonel Wyman, Colonel Caffey, Colonel Talley. Caffey commanded at Utah, Talley commanded at Omaha, and then we got General Lucius Clay, who was a very famous general, a lieutenant general, and then we got General Iran, and then we got General Koenig. These men were outstanding. You know, if he would tell you something, any of these men would tell you something, you could take it to the bank. He wouldn't say, why did you do that? Well, you told me. No, I didn't. These men were very high grade. Yeah. And I asked Colonel Wyman one time, he lived out in California, and we lived in California too, so we had dinner one night, and I asked him, I said, how were you able to get so much work out of me? And he says, well, first of all, you had to be able to. And I said, well, how do you find that out? He says, study the background. He says, I studied everything I could find out about you. The main thing you want to find out is, how did they finish off what they started? Did the man finish what he began? But you know, Lucius Clay and Iran and Colonel Wyman were all three in World War I. And they were all graduates of the West Point. And we used to kid that there was a West Point Protective Association. So if you were a West Point man and there was a job opening, usually the West Point guy would get it. Yeah. But Iran, even though he was the class of 1915, he gave the best job to me. And when he was coming to the 65th reunion of the class of 15 in 1980, I talked to him on the phone, and he invited me and my wife to come up to see him. Well, all these high-ranking men were staying at the Thayer Hotel right inside the entrance to West Point. So Mary and I went there, and we went up to the desk at the Thayer Hotel, and I asked if General General Orand was registered. The lady said, yes, he is, but I think he's resting right now. I said, when do you think he might get up? She says, well, later in the day. I said, okay, we'll wait. So I suggested that my wife sit down and I'd go case the joint and see if I could see anybody. Well, I saw this sign, class of 1915. And there were two men sitting outside the door. So I went up to him and I said, would either of you men know General Orand? This one young man, he says, yes, I do. He's my father. So I said, well, I was his G4. I'm Frank Ladwig. He says, I've heard about you. So he excused himself. The other guy was the secretary of the class of 1915. He was a colonel. But Orand had a history of all of the class of 1915, and he came to the conclusion that there were more stars on the shoulders of men from the class of 15 than they were men. 5 stars for General Eisenhower, 4 stars for Bradley, 3 stars for Orand, 3 stars for Lucius Clay. So you can see how that could build up.
Sure.
But a lot of them got to be generals. But I deduced that the main reason that I was able to do fairly well is that I knew that these men expected me to do well.
Yeah.
Or naturally they wouldn't have appointed me. But for instance, D-Day was supposed to be June 5th rather than 6th, but the weather was so bad that they postponed it a day. Well, I had all these trucks waiting around to, not knowing whether we're going to take them all these guys back home and try again in a month or two. So I called Wyman and I said, should I I borrowed these 1,500 trucks. I said, should I send those trucks back or should I keep them? He thought for a minute, he says, hold them. Because he didn't know whether we were going to postpone or not.
Right.
And, but I was amazed at how objective our leaders were.
Yeah.
They were very objective, and like Eisenhower. When I asked that general to give us full headlights, Eisenhower didn't bat his eyelash.
Yeah.
I said, I don't think you'd get 100,000 tons down there, and the roads were terrible, and we had superiority in the air. And Eisenhower responded just like that. He could have been criticized, like everything, by a lot of his own generals for letting us have full headlights.
Yeah.
But I just admired them so much. I gave them the best I had.
Yeah. Yeah. How about that story of the flashlights? Did you
Oh,
tell
yeah.
me
Well,
that? That's
one
a
day.
great story.
Yeah, there's another story I wanted to tell you too.
Sure.
Thanks. One day, a young fella came in from Rouen. Rouen was not too far from Deauville, where our headquarters was at that time. And he said that he was the commanding officer of the Air Force Depot in Rouen. And I don't remember his name, but he said, they're stealing us blind, and we need some flashlights. And he says, I can't get any flashlights out of the Air Force. So he says, can you give us some flashlights? I said, well, let me see. So I called our chief signal officer, and I said, do we have some flashlights, a lot of them? He says, oh, we have tons of them. I said, well, I'm going to send a young man down to you. Would you please give him 80 flashlights? He says, no problem. So the young fellow thanked me, and as he was about to go out the door, he turned around, he says, would you have a use for a small airplane? I said, I don't know. Why? He says, I have an airplane in our depot there that's not on anyone's books. You're the only man that would listen to me about the flashlights. So he says, if you'll send one of your pilots, we had 5 airplanes in our headquarters. If you'd send one of your pilots over, I'll give him the airplane. I said, okay, we'll send him over. I had his name then. So we got this little L-4 airplane. Another story that I think you would like is, what was this story now? Jeeps.
That's right, Jeeps, yes.
The commanding officer of our quartermaster depot in Charleroi, Belgium, came up to Brussels, where our headquarters was then, and he said, now you've always told me no on all questionable supplies. He says, so I brought our administrative officer here so he could tell you just how badly we need 45 Jeeps. And this young fella got up and he said, we have been using a couple thousand German prisoners, and these German prisoners have German officers, naturally. And he says, we rent sedans to haul these people around. And the Belgians have now gotten up on their high horse, and they say we will no longer drive German officers around in sedans, because there'd be a German officer and an American officer in the sedan. And the American officer would tell his guys what to do, and the German officer would tell the German prisoners what to do. So I thought about it. So I said, yes, you can have them. So I called the chief ordnance officer, and I said, I'm sending a man down to you. Would you please give him 45 Jeeps? He says, glad to. We've got Jeeps coming out of our ears.
Yeah.
So then this colonel said, I don't understand. You say we can have 45? I said, that's what you asked for. And he said, but you've always said no. I said, well, I turned to this major, I said, do you remember me? He says, I don't believe so. I said, well, I remember you. When I came from Washington to Camp Lee, Virginia, you were the chief administrative officer. And he says, that's right. I said, I came down there to learn how to be a truck company commander. He says, we had a great school. I said, I had screwed up the ad in the newspaper to sell my furniture in Washington, and I came to you to ask if I could have a 3-day pass to go back to Washington, and you said, well, there's no leaves. He says, but I tell you what, I will fill out a pass for you and put it in my desk drawer. Now, if anything gets in your way so you can't be back here at 8 a.m. Monday morning, You call me on the phone, and here's my number. And then I'll give you the pass so you're not AWOL. I said, now, Major, you and I are even.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah. That's great. That's great.
But we were just a bunch of guys, you know.
Well, talking about being a bunch of guys, why don't you tell me a little bit about your feelings about the war, your feelings after the war? I mean, did we do the right thing? Where were you when the atomic bomb went off? How did you feel about that, and Harry Truman and that sort of thing? Can you touch on that?
The funny thing was, on the atomic bomb, I thought it was a very wise decision. A college mate of mine wrote the letter to President Truman, and he personally delivered it from Washington to, what was the name of the conference right at that time? After the war. Potsdam, yeah. Okay. He delivered to President Truman so Truman could tell Stalin and Churchill of what we were going to do. And I thought it saved a lot of lives. But since then, I've kind of changed my mind, because I studied the military writer for the New York Times, and a number of Army officers that have written in these books. They said Japan was already defeated. We didn't have to drop the atomic bomb on them, because it destroyed the American picture to the world that we were inhumane, you know, to drop the bomb twice and killed all those Japanese. And I kind of sympathized with him. I don't know if we really knew that the Japanese were beaten, but after we dropped the bomb, the Russians came in. They wanted to get in on the act because they wanted some spoils from Japan. And so I don't think we would have had to kill all those Japanese. As far as the war was concerned, I went along with what President Roosevelt did and said. I had my own arguments over why we didn't prepare our Army and Air Force people in Hawaii. I always felt that in Washington we knew, or we had strong suspicions. So their defense, see, Colonel Wyman came to us from Hawaii, and he was interviewed by the Congressional Investigating Committee of Hawaii. And when he left us in Cherbourg to go, he would be gone for a month. As he was going out the door, he lifted up his briefcase and he said, "I will bet you all the tea in China that I will not be permitted to open my briefcase." And when he came back, I said, "Colonel, did you open your briefcase?" He said, "No." He says, "The only thing that would have happened if I had opened my briefcase is that the American public would have lost an awful lot of confidence in their leaders." So I didn't think that it was necessary to lose all of those men. You know, Eisenhower said something about Berlin. See, Montgomery and Churchill wanted to be the first ones into Berlin so they could march down under Den Linden. And Eisenhower said no. What's to be gained by taking Berlin? We have reduced it to rubble. Montgomery and Churchill, Montgomery wanted to lead all the troops down under Den Linden, and Churchill wanted to be in the stands, get his picture worldwide. But Eisenhower said, there's nothing to be gained, in my opinion, by taking Berlin at that point, and I will not lose one single soldier for a public relations campaign. And we didn't. We never did take Berlin. And the Russians did. They got nothing special out of it because the dividing up of Germany was accomplished months before at one of the big Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt meetings. They divided up who was going to get what. And so Eisenhower had a tough time holding Patton back because Patton wanted to go sailing in over the Elbe River, and Eisenhower said, no, sir, don't you dare do that. And it made Patton mad, but Eisenhower was not a bloodthirsty leader. Some of those guys, I think, were. But as far as my general views of World War II, I was too young, I think, to have real solid views on that. But I sure do hope that General Eisenhower's thoughts that we must find some way to gain an eternal peace for this world. In Normandy Base Section alone, we had 110,000 graves. It's an awful lot of young men stopped in their prime, cut off in their prime. But at the time, I just did what I was asked to do. I just did my job, and I didn't second guess anyone, except to be honest with you, I second guessed Marshall for not telling the Pearl Harbor people more forcefully. You know, they defended themselves by saying, we told them to be alert. But that's like saying when someone goes out to drive the car, be careful.
Now, where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor, and how did that affect you?
I was in Washington.
You were,
in the Office of the Quartermaster General, and I roomed with Larry Campbell, who was an ensign in the Navy, and we heard it on the radio together. We couldn't believe it. But we were so excited, you know, we got the word on the radio that everyone report to work in military uniforms. And I can still see Larry Campbell shining his shoes.
Oh my God.
We were, I tell you, when we went to work on Monday morning, Office of Quartermaster General was a very exciting place.
Yeah. Things were different then, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
I don't think that's a good answer to you, but we pretty much did what we were told.
Right, right.
And but I always wished that the people in Pearl Harbor had gotten more specific instructions. That's my thought.
Okay, okay. You mentioned before that you went over on the Queen Mary.
Oh yes.
Would you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, that was very
pretty
interesting.
exciting. Yeah.
That was a very exciting ride. We were at Camp Shanks in New York, and we got the word to load our battalion and our regiment. I was a battalion commander by that time, to load onto the Queen Mary. And we were told that there were 15,000 of us on the Queen Mary, and that we left at about 10 o'clock in the morning, sailed by the Statue of Liberty, and it was a kind of a heart-wrenching thing. We were leaving America, and we were going out through the German submarines. Now this was very early in September of 1943.
Okay.
And we started out all by ourselves, and every so often, not on a so many hours and seconds, but irregularly, we would make a zigzag.
Zigzag pattern.
A zigzag pattern, and the Queen Mary would shudder.
Yeah.
And sometimes the dishes in the dining room could go sailing across the dining room. We would, one time, I was told that we had a 39-degree list. You take the Queen Mary on a 39-degree list, it could have tipped over.
That's right, yeah.
And every morning at 11 o'clock, the people that were above decks would go down the back stairway of the Queen Mary, and the people that had been below decks would come up the front stairway, so that they had fresh air for 24 hours, and the people that had been there went down the back stairway, and they'd start serving meals about 5 a.m. And they would serve 2 meals a day, and that was a logistics nightmare to get 15,000 people and feed them. Only about 20 minutes per person.
Right.
But since I was a major, I had a stateroom, and I shared that with 3 others. And we had the right to go into the big lounges and so forth and play cards, and but you'd go out and stand on the rail, all you could see was ocean.
Yeah.
And I never will forget coming into the Firth of Clyde in Scotland. See, we zigged all the way clear down to I forget the islands.
The Channel Islands?
Channel, yeah, down there. And then we came up north and went into the Firth of Clyde to unload. And we unloaded all by lighters. And that was a trick too. Most people lost their luggage. one young fella came up to Colonel Wyman. He says, "Could I take your bags?" Colonel Wyman says, "Are you going to walk beside me?" He says, "No, I'm going to take it to the truck, and they'll take it up to your train." Wyman says, "Thank you, no.
Yeah.
I'll carry it." He was the only one out of the 398th engineers that ended up in England with his luggage. It took them 2 or 3 months to sort out all the luggage.
Yeah.
You know, you hear about airplane passengers.
Losing it.
That's 200 or 300 people.
Yeah.
But we had 15,000.
My God.
Everybody had two and a barracks bag B and a barracks bag A. And so that if you lost it, hopefully one of the, and your name was stenciled on the barracks bag. When we got to Salisbury, we took the train from Glasgow to London, and then we took the train to Salisbury. When we got there, our records had been sent to Bristol. So our regimental commander asked me to go up there to Bristol and get those records and bring them back to Salisbury. I drew a limousine from the motor pool, and they had British women drivers. So it was all right going up. Coming back, it was dark. And this lady was very nervous, so she said, "Major, would you be good enough to drive? I just am too nervous to drive."
Yeah.
Everything was blackout,
Sure.
and they drove on the British side of the road. So I got in. I tell you, I was nervous too, just driving on the
Yeah.
wrong side of the road. But we got back home to okay.
Excellent. How about them? You mentioned your British driver.
Yeah.
What was it like with the English people? Did they accept Americans? You guys got along well?
Very well.
Yeah.
I was assigned a room with one of the officers of our regiment to a house called the Harnham House in Salisbury on the Bournemouth Road, and the lady who owned the house, her husband was in a Japanese prison camp.
Wow.
And her son was in the British Army, and I kept my stuff there for almost a year.
Yeah.
And when I was ready to go over to France, I went back. Normally I would just go up to the house, open the door, and go up to my room.
Yeah.
But this time something told me, don't be too fresh. So I rang the doorbell. And she came to the door. I forget what her name was now. But she started to cry. And I said, "What's the matter?" I forget the young man's name.
Yeah.
But she said her son had been killed in France in a tank. And so I told her how sorry, and I took all my stuff, and we went over to France on an LST. One time I was going up to London on a conference, and my landlady said, "I'll make you a good breakfast," because it was very difficult to get real eggs.
Yeah.
We got ersatz eggs, and somehow she got 2 eggs and made me a wonderful breakfast.
How wonderful.
And I went up to London to this meeting, and it was over about noontime. So I thought, you know what, I'd like to see their parliament. So I went to down to the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and there was a British bobby standing at the door. And I thought, a confident manner will get you in almost anywhere. So I started to go right in, and he stuck his arm out, and he says, "Who are you calling to see?" I said, "How would I know anybody to see?" I was in my uniform.
Sure.
And he says, "Well, because the war is on, you have to have an appointment." So I thought real fast, and I said, "Who would be a good man to see?" And then I had him. And he says, "Well, Sir J. Lucas is a great friend of the Americans." I said, "That's who I'm going to see, Sir J. Lucas." He says, "Okay, go in."
Oh my goodness, what a good story.
And I went up to the desk and filled out 3 or 4 cards, and the man at the desk gave me one card, and he says, "Take this into the rotunda and give it to the policeman, and he will page Sir J." So I did. Pretty soon a very handsome guy came on. He says, "Hi, Si. Who's called in to see Sir J. Lucas?" I said, "Me." And he came over, and I said, "Now, you can have me thrown out if you like. I got in here on a ruse." But the man at the door said, "You were a good friend of the Americans." So I said, "That's who I'm calling to see." He says, "Jolly good. Let me see if I can get you a ticket." Because Winston Churchill had addressed the House of Commons that morning, and everybody was there. So he came out in a couple of minutes, and he says, "Do you mind sitting in the best seat in the House?" I said, "Not at all." So the way the House of Commons was laid out is that the Speaker was sitting here, and those friends of the Prime Minister would sit here, and the opposition would sit over here. And then there were 2 boxes behind the Speaker, and there were 3 chairs in each box. And there was 1 chair unoccupied in this box. So he took me in and sat me there. And then he sat on the railing, and as members of the opposition would come by, he'd say, "I'd like to have you meet my friend from America, Frank Ladwig."
Yeah, wonderful.
So I met a number of the big congressmen, and I stayed there for an hour and a half or so, and he gave me the envelope. He had gotten a note back from the Prime Minister that morning, and I said, "Do you think I could borrow that envelope so I could know how to spell your name and all?" He said, "Sure, you can have it." And so I wrote to him and thanked him for things, and told him if he ever came to America, call me and I'll treat you like you treated me.
Right.
Yeah, and it's good. Then I went to the, what's the big church in England?
St. Paul's.
Yeah, where all the
They're buried.
the kings and queens
Yes.
and so forth
St.
been
Paul's Cathedral,
married.
yes.
I went there, and there was no one around, so I unhooked the velvet rope, and I went and stood on the spot where all the kings and queens had stood when they were married, and I had a terrific afternoon. So. To answer your question, yes, the British treated us very well.
I guess so. And
See, we had almost twice as many soldiers in Europe as the British did. See, on Eisenhower's staff, except for this General Beadle Smith, who was his chief of staff, most of his key guys were British. And he got credit for being amazingly successful in melding the British and the Americans. See, because I guess it was just natural. The British had their ideas of how the war should be run, and the Americans had their ideas. Mm-hmm. And they had some very serious battles. And in this book, Ike, the author there, Michael Korda, told how Ike was able to manage them all. The worst one was Montgomery. He was a prize pain in the neck, or lower than that even.
Yeah.
But near the end of the war, Eisenhower went around them all and wrote a letter to Stalin. And everybody was down on him for that, because they said, you should have gone through the chief of all operations and had him contacted. Eisenhower knew Stalin and was friendly with him, and so he just went directly to him. But Eisenhower was able to control Churchill and I forget the man's name. I think his Lord was his last name, but Allenbrook.
Beaverbrook.
I think
Allenbrook.
Allenbrook.
Right, yeah.
And they had low opinions of each other.
Yeah.
And it was very hard to be friendly and nice to them when you thought so poorly of them.
Yeah.
But Montgomery thought he was the hero of El Alamein and was the smartest strategist and tactician in the field. And our generals thought the same of themselves.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult to manage them. But Eisenhower maintained his objectivity for the most part, and so he was able to get them to do what he wanted. But I wish we didn't. I think there were 20 to 30 million human beings killed in World War II,
Yeah.
especially in Russia. And when you think that in Normandy base alone, we had these 110 graves, we lost an awful lot of people in that war, and some of it was necessary and some of it wasn't. For instance, we bombed St. Lo, and we dropped leaflets before we bombed them, but the wind blew the leaflets out of town,
Oh my.
so they never got the word,
Wow. Yeah.
and we killed 10,000 people
Oh my God.
in St. Lo.
Wow.
And we did the same in Le Havre, 11 o'clock in the morning. We dropped the leaflets, and they never got them, and we bombed Le Havre right in the height of the shopping time.
Oh, good.
And we killed 10,000 in Le Havre. So they would look through us, where we had killed a lot of people, and you couldn't much blame them,
Yeah.
but we killed an awful lot of people.
Circumstances, yeah.
And this D-Day book says there was 30 million people in 6 of the 7 continents of the world.
Wow.
See, we had the war in the South Pacific, we had the war in Asia, we had the whole world
Yeah.
was fighting in World War II.
Yeah.
See, in World War I, it was just a European war.
Right.
In World War II, we were worldwide,
Yeah.
and we killed an awful lot of human beings. And as Ike says, that he thought and hoped and prayed that humanity will have learned we must find some way to gain an eternal peace for this world.
Yeah.
I don't think we did, but we sure tried.
Yeah.
I gave them all my and everybody in our family was involved in some way in World War II.
Well, Frank, I'm honored. I'm moved, and I made a very special friend today.
I have too.
Thanking you for the information, for sharing the high points, the low points, the honesty of war, the tragedy, and your involvement. So with that, I thank you. The Veterans History Project thanks you. And
Thank you for making it possible.
okay, my friend, thank you very much, Frank Ladwig.
Thank you, Jim, and
Let's hold.
please give me copies of.
Absolutely. Let's
Okay.
hold that up for the
Okay.
camera. Let's see. Go up a little higher, Frank. A little more. Perfect. And with that, I thank you very much. And